The Ritz Century's lobby gleamed like a freshly polished crown jewel in Manhattan's skyline. Crystal chandeliers dangled from 30-foot ceilings, their light dancing across marble floors so pristine you could perform surgery on them. Men in tailored Armani and women dripping in diamonds drifted through the space, their voices a gentle murmur of privilege. James Thornton entered through the revolving door, the cool October air following him inside. His charcoal suit was well made, but understated, his single leather weekender bag held casually in one hand. Nothing flashy, nothing desperate for attention, just a man who knew quality without needing to broadcast it. At the reception desk, 3 staff members stood in perfect posture, their matching Navy uniforms pressed to military precision. The tallest one, a woman with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes, glanced up at James, then immediately backed down, determining his worth in that split second. "Good afternoon," James said, his Canadian accent gentle but clear. "I was hoping to book a suite for the weekend." The receptionist's fingers hovered over her keyboard. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" "No, I'm afraid not. It was a rather spontaneous trip." Behind the reception desk, a man in his 40s with slicked-back hair and a custom suit emerged from an office. His gold name tag read Vincent Carter, General Manager. He scanned James from head to toe, taking in the modest luggage, the lack of an entourage, the quiet demeanor. "Is there a problem here, Charlotte?" Carter asked, not addressing James directly. "This gentleman is inquiring about a suite. No reservation." Carter's smile was a masterclass in condescension. "I see." He finally turned to James. "I'm afraid all our suites are reserved for our VIP guests. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the Marriott down the street." James tilted his head slightly. "There seems to be some confusion. I checked your availability online before arriving. You have several presidential suites vacant." The manager's smile tightened. Nearby, a Saudi prince and his security detail watched with mild interest. A couple of guests had already pulled out their phones, sensing the brewing confrontation. "Sir," Carter said, lowering his voice to a stage whisper that carried just far enough for the nearby guests to hear, "the Ritz Century caters to a certain caliber of clientele. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." James blinked, his expression betraying nothing but mild confusion. "I'm sorry, there must be some misunderstanding. I'd like to book a suite. I'm perfectly willing to pay the full rate." Carter folded his arms, gold cufflinks catching the light. "There's no misunderstanding, sir. Our suites are reserved for guests with standing. Celebrities, dignitaries, business leaders." He gestured vaguely around the lobby. "People who belong here." A small gathering of onlookers had formed a discreet semicircle. 2 women in designer dresses whispered behind manicured hands. A Wall Street type smirked over his Manhattan. "I don't mean to cause any trouble," James said, his voice steady. "Perhaps I could speak with someone else." "I am the general manager," Carter replied, drawing himself up to his full height. "There is no one else to speak with." The receptionist, Charlotte, shifted uncomfortably. She glanced at her computer screen again, fingers nervously tapping the edge of her keyboard. "Might I ask what criteria you use to determine who can book a suite?" James asked, still infuriatingly calm. Carter's jaw tightened. "Sir, this is a private establishment. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who doesn't meet our standards. And what standards am I failing to meet, exactly?" The question hung in the air. A Japanese businessman who had been watching the exchange raised an eyebrow, his interpreter whispering in his ear. Carter's voice dropped to a theatrical whisper. "Look at you. No driver, no assistant, one small bag. You're clearly not the sort who stays in our presidential suite." James nodded thoughtfully as though Carter had made a reasonable point. "I see. So it's about appearances." "It's about belonging," Carter snapped, losing patience. "And you don't belong." The receptionist looked increasingly uncomfortable. She leaned toward her colleague, murmuring something. The second receptionist's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Carter," she began, but he silenced her with a sharp glance. "Sarah, please escort this gentleman to the exit," Carter said to a nearby security officer. "And perhaps," he added, turning back to James with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, "maybe try one of the budget hotels down the street. I believe there's a Holiday Inn in Midtown that might be more appropriate for your situation." The security officer, a tall woman with a stern expression, approached James with professional detachment. "Sir, if you'll come with me." James held up his hand, a gentle gesture that somehow carried enough authority to make Sarah hesitate. The lobby had grown quieter, the background music suddenly more noticeable. "Before I go," James said, "I'd like to understand exactly what's happening here." He turned to survey the magnificent space, taking in the soaring ceilings, the fresh flowers arranged in vases worth more than most cars. "This is a beautiful hotel. One of the finest in New York, I'm told." Carter's expression flickered between annoyance and satisfaction at the compliment. "It is, indeed, which is why we must be selective." "Selective," James repeated, tasting the word. "Based on what?" "Sir," the security officer interjected, "I need to escort you out." From the corner, a middle-aged man in a maintenance uniform had stopped polishing brass fixtures to watch. His eyes narrowed in recognition, but nobody noticed him slipping away toward the back offices. "One moment," James said, his politeness unwavering despite the growing tension. "Mr. Carter, I find your position fascinating. You judge people based on appearance, on whether they arrive with an entourage, on the size of their luggage." A young couple who had been checking in paused, the husband whispering to his wife, "Is he somebody?" The wife shrugged but kept watching, her phone discreetly recording. Carter's patience had evaporated entirely. "This discussion is over. Sarah, please remove this man immediately." The security officer took James's arm. "Sir, please." James didn't resist, but he also didn't move. "I'm curious about one thing, Mr. Carter. How long have you been general manager here?" Carter blinked, thrown by the question. 5 years. Now, if you'll— 5 years, James nodded. "And in those 5 years, have you ever encountered the owner?" Charlotte, the receptionist, suddenly went pale. She began typing furiously at her terminal, her colleague leaning in to look at the screen. "Mr. Carter," she called, her voice tight with urgency. "I think you should—" "Not now, Charlotte." Carter snapped without looking at her. James gently removed the security officer's hand from his arm. The movement was so smooth, so assured, that she let him go without thinking. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his phone. Carter's face flushed with anger. "Are you filming this? You can't—" "I'm not filming anything," James said, calmly. "I'm making a call." He tapped the screen once, then held it to his ear. "All right," he said softly. "Let's settle this." "Hello, Patricia," James said into the phone, his voice transforming into something more commanding. "It's James Donovan. Yes, I'm actually standing in the Century New York lobby right now." At the mention of the name, Charlotte's eyes widened to saucers. She frantically tapped her colleague's arm, pointing at her screen. "It seems there's been some confusion about my accommodations," James continued, his gaze fixed on Carter. "The general manager, Vincent Carter, yes, seems to believe I don't— How did you put it, Mr. Carter? Ah, yes, belong here." Carter's smirk began to waver as he watched the panic spreading among his staff. The second receptionist was now on the phone, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "Yes, Patricia, if you could update the system, I'd appreciate it." "Apparently, visual confirmation is required." James's voice remained calm, but there was now a subtle edge to it, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The maintenance man had returned, accompanied by an older woman in an executive suit who took one look at James and froze. "Oh my God," she whispered. Guests had stopped pretending not to watch. The Japanese businessman was speaking rapidly to his interpreter. The Wall Street type who had been smirking was now frowning in confusion. "Thank you, Patricia," James concluded, ending the call. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and smiled at Carter, who stood rigid, uncertainty beginning to crack his facade of authority. "Mr. Carter," Charlotte called, her voice shaking, "you need to look at this right away." Carter didn't move, trapped between his public stance and the growing realization that something was terribly wrong. From across the lobby, the woman in the executive suit approached rapidly. "Mr. Donovan," she said, breathless, "we had no idea. You were coming. I'm Elizabeth Winters, Director of Operations." She shot a venomous glance at Carter. "I can't begin to apologize for this misunderstanding." Carter's face drained of color. "Donovan?" he repeated, as in. The security officer who had been about to escort James out took 3 quick steps backward. James smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "You might want to check your system again, Mr. Carter. I believe my status has been clarified." From somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera flashed. The whispers grew louder. Carter finally broke his paralysis and rushed to the computer terminal. He stared at the screen, his entire body going rigid as the letters glowed mockingly before him. James Donovan, owner, Thornton International. Hotel Group, VIP status, executive. Carter gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white. This must be some kind of mistake," he stammered. "Some kind of prank." The lobby had fallen into a charged silence. Even the background music seemed to have quieted, as though the hotel itself was holding its breath. "No mistake," Elizabeth Winters said, her professional smile fixed in place. "Mr. Donovan is the majority shareholder and CEO of Thornton International, our parent company." She turned to James, practically genuflecting. "We had no notification of your visit, sir." "That was rather the point," James replied, his Canadian lilt somehow more pronounced now that everyone was paying attention. "I prefer to experience our properties as a typical guest would." Carter's face had turned the color of spoiled milk. "I don't believe it," he said, a final, desperate gambit. "Anyone could claim to be James Donovan. Where's your ID? Your proof?" Collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Elizabeth looked as though she might faint. "Vincent," Charlotte hissed, "his credentials are verified in the system." But Carter was clinging to denial like a life raft. "It could be a system hack. Corporate espionage. I need to see official identification." James raised an eyebrow, seemingly more amused than offended. His pocket buzzed. He withdrew his phone, glanced at it, and smiled. "It seems word travels fast. Your regional director is calling." He held the phone up for Carter to see the name flashing on the screen. Marcus Reynolds, Regional Director, North America. Carter swallowed hard. Behind him, the 2 receptionists exchanged horrified glances. "Perhaps you'd like to speak with him," James offered. Before Carter could respond, the maintenance man who had recognized James earlier approached, holding a tablet. "Sir, if it helps, I have the company newsletter from last month's executive retreat." He handed the tablet to Carter. "Mr. Donovan's photo is on the cover." The tablet displayed a corporate magazine with a crystal-clear image of James Donovan standing alongside other executives at a mountain resort, the headline reading, "Thornton International's Vision 2026. CEO James Donovan charts the course." Carter stared at the image, then at James, then back at the tablet. His last defense crumbled. "Still want me to try the Holiday Inn?" James asked quietly. From the corner of his eye, Carter could see hotel guests recording the entire exchange on their phones. His career was imploding in real time, broadcast for the world to see. "Let me be absolutely clear," James said, his voice cutting through the silence like a polished blade. "I'm not just a VIP guest. I'm not just an executive." He gestured around, the opulent lobby. "I own this hotel, and the one in Chicago, and the ones in Los Angeles, Miami, London, Tokyo, Dubai. 47 properties in total. The Saudi prince who had been watching the spectacle unfold murmured something to his assistant, who nodded vigorously. The Japanese businessman bowed slightly in James's direction, a gesture of newfound respect. Carter's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. Sweat beaded along his hairline. "Mr. Donovan," he finally managed, "I had no idea—" "Clearly," James interrupted. "You had no idea who I was, which is precisely the point, Mr. Carter. If I had arrived with an entourage, with Louis Vuitton luggage and a private secretary, you would have fallen over yourself to accommodate me. Instead, you saw a man traveling alone, and you decided he wasn't worthy of respect." Elizabeth stepped forward. "Mr. Donovan, I can assure you that Mr. Carter's behavior does not reflect our company values or training protocols. If you'll allow me to—" James raised a hand, silencing her instantly. "I've stayed at hundreds of hotels around the world, Ms. Winters. The true measure of hospitality isn't how you treat guests who announce their importance. It's how you treat every person who walks through your doors." The young couple, who had been recording, exchanged glances. The husband mouthed "viral" to his wife. Carter had found his voice again, desperation making it high and tight. "Mr. Donovan, please, this is a misunderstanding. If you had identified yourself—" "Why should I have to?" James countered. "Why should anyone? Is courtesy now a privilege reserved only for those you deem important?" The maintenance worker smiled, slightly, nodding in agreement. Several other staff members had emerged from back offices, drawn by the commotion, watching their manager's downfall with barely concealed satisfaction. "I've been in the hospitality business for 30 years, James continued. "I built this company on one simple principle. Every guest deserves dignity and respect." Carter's face had gone from white to green. His career, his reputation, his future, all balancing on the knife's edge of this Canadian billionaire's judgment. "Mr. Donovan," he pleaded, "I can explain—" James tilted his head slightly. "Actually, I think you've explained plenty. The only question remaining is—" He paused, looking Carter directly in the eyes. "Do you still want me to leave?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause, as though the building itself was awaiting Carter's response. "Of course not," Carter whispered, defeat hollowing his voice. "You're welcome to stay, Mr. Donovan. The presidential suite is—" "I'll take a standard suite," James interrupted. "The presidential suite should be saved for someone who needs the extra space." His tone made it clear the decision was final. Elizabeth Winters stepped forward again. "I'll personally oversee the arrangements, Mr. Donovan, and, I assure you, we'll be conducting a full review of our guest protocols." Carter stood frozen, watching his authority dissolve before his eyes. The staff who had followed his lead now avoided looking at him, rushing to correct his catastrophic error. Charlotte was already preparing key cards, another receptionist was summoning bellhops, and the security officer who had nearly escorted James out now stood at attention, eyes forward as though guarding a head of state. From the back of the lobby, Marcus Reynolds, the regional director, burst through the doors, straightening his tie as he hurried across the marble floor. He must have been nearby when the call came in. His face was a mask of controlled panic. "Mr. Donovan," he said, slightly out of breath, "what an unexpected pleasure." He shot a murderous glance at Carter. James nodded. "Marcus, good to see you." "I'm being briefed on the situation," Marcus said carefully. "Rest assured, we'll address it immediately." The surrounding guests had given up any pretense of disinterest. Phones were openly recording now, capturing every moment of Carter's humiliation for posterity. The Wall Street type who had smirked earlier was now frantically searching James Donovan on his phone, eyes widening as he scrolled. Forbes lists. "His net worth at $11 billion, he whispered to his companion, loud enough for Carter to hear. Carter looked physically ill. The magnitude of his error was still unfolding. Not just any VIP, one of the wealthiest men in North America. Not just any hotel. The flagship property of Donovan's entire empire. "Mr. Carter," Marcus said, his voice tight with suppressed rage, "a word in private, please." But before Carter could move, James spoke. "Actually, Marcus, I think we've had enough privacy for one day." He turned to Carter, his expression calm but implacable. "Pack your things, Mr. Carter. You're fired." In that moment, Vincent Carter ceased to exist as the powerful general manager of the Ritz Century. In the eyes of everyone present, he was, already gone. Two security officers appeared as if conjured by James's words, flanking Carter on either side. Not the same officers who had nearly removed James. These men were from executive security, summoned by Marcus with a subtle gesture. "Please escort Mr. Carter to his office to collect his personal items," Marcus instructed. "Then see him out of the building." Carter didn't resist. There was nothing left to fight for. His shoulders slumped as the security team guided him toward the back offices, the whispers and stares of guests and staff following him like a poisonous wake. As Carter disappeared from view, the energy in the lobby transformed. Staff members straightened, smiles became genuine, movements quickened with purpose. It was as though a dark cloud had lifted, revealing the sun. "Mr. Donovan," Charlotte said, her voice steadier now, "your suite is ready. The Sapphire Suite on the 30th floor. It has the best view of Central Park." James nodded, accepting the keycard she offered. "Thank you, Charlotte. We've arranged for champagne, and our executive chef is preparing a special welcome menu," Elizabeth added. "Unless you'd prefer privacy?" "The champagne will be fine," James said. "No need for special treatment." The irony of the statement wasn't lost on anyone present. The man who had been deemed unworthy of basic courtesy 30 minutes ago was now the center of a deferential galaxy. As a bellhop, who had materialized from nowhere, reached for James's weekender bag, James shook his head. "I can manage, thank you." He turned to Marcus. "I'll need a full report by morning, not just on Carter but on our customer service protocols across all North American properties." "Of course, sir. I'll have it on your desk by 7 a.m. James began walking. Toward the elevators, Marcus and Elizabeth trailing in his wake. The crowd of onlookers parted like the Red Sea. At the elevator, James paused and turned back to the lobby. The guests and staff were still watching, still processing the seismic shift they had witnessed. "One more thing," he called to Marcus. "Find out who that maintenance worker was, the one with the tablet. I want to speak with him tomorrow. That kind of loyalty deserves recognition." The elevator doors opened. James stepped inside alone, declining the entourage that tried to follow. As the doors began to close, his voice drifted across the hushed lobby. "Funny, I came here to book a room. Turns out I needed to clean house first." The doors sealed shut, leaving behind a transformed hotel, and dozens of witnesses with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives.